All right, so good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you're joining us from, everyone. My name is Jesse, and I am with Exploring by the Seat of Your Pants. So we're all about bringing conservation, adventure, and science into classrooms around the world. So today's talk is a little bit special. It's very unique. It's part of our partnership with the Arctic Institute of North America. So they are Canada's first and longest-lived Arctic Research Institute. And over the next few months and over the past few months, we've had the pleasure of working with them on highlighting some really amazing Arctic stories. And in our work with kids across Canada, one of the big yearnings is for more stories of what's going on in the Arctic. It's opening up to the public, it's opening up for tourism, it's opening up for development. And so there's a huge interest for a lot of kids worldwide and certainly across Canada in understanding some of the challenges and opportunities that are happening in Canada's north. So I'm really excited to dive in with today's talk, and especially on this topic. So we are joined by Dr. Jennifer Provencher. And two notes about her before we get started. Her work today, her talk is going to talk about plastic pollution in the Arctic, which again, plastic pollution is a topic that is wildly popular now. It's in the news. It's something that no one was really thinking about in a serious way in the public until the last 10 years or so. And now classrooms across Canada, around the world, are really keen to understand more about these challenges. So plastic pollution in the Arctic is our theme of the day. And when I've had the privilege of working with a lot of amazing plastic pollution researchers personally and through our organization, and almost every single one of them says, have you talked to Jennifer? So you could not be having a better guide than Dr. Provencher today. I'm going to turn it over to her. Thank you so much for joining us, and I cannot wait for your talk. Take it away.
Awesome. Thanks, Jesse. I'm really excited to be here today to talk to everyone, and certainly with the Arctic Institute of North America, they've been super supportive of my work and my graduate degrees, and it's really exciting to be here. So I will turn to my presentation. I'm going to turn my webcam off just because I'm having some these challenges as we all, learn from working from home and what that looks like. So today, I want to give a shout out to everyone who's tuned in today, all the students. I was a student, I loved biology, I loved science, but, I never thought I, could imagine where it had taken me in the last couple of years. And so I am now a research scientist with Environment and Climate Change Canada. I focus mostly on plastic pollution and contaminants, but we do have a few other things. So just really quickly, I work on wildlife health. And so lots of people say, well, what is wildlife health? And so we think a lot about migratory birds because I do work for Environment and Climate Change Canada. And in my group in particular, we think about plastic pollution. So you can see in this picture, it's an albatross chicken. It's got a whole bunch of plastic in its stomach. In my lab, we also talk about pathogens or other agents, diseases, reasons why you would have kind of mass mortality or unusual mortality in birds. We also have been doing a lot more oil work. So this is where birds, they could get oiled, but we're thinking more about this in terms of what it looks like from a contaminant perspective. And so these are all things that appear in the way that we think about it, and specifically what I work on. We also have other groups and connections where we think about bigger plastics, so litter and entanglement. I also have projects on fisheries, and so this is kind of a plastic one as well, but birds can get entangled in fishing gear. We think about this. And of course, there's harvest. And so we have harvest in Canada, we have traditional harvest and harvest worldwide. All of these things can affect bird health. And so these are things that we work on with kind of this top row that we think about the most. So today we're going to be talking specifically about plastic pollution in the Arctic. And so these are all pictures of plastic pollution that have been found in the Arctic. In this top corner are all of the plastics that we have found inside of sticks. This is actually a picture from my master's that I did about 10 years ago. And then these are some of the pictures. So this is an Arctic tern with larger plastic litter. It's been entangled, carrier entanglement for sure. These are Boro pictures on Svalbard where we've seen this happen. We have a project where we look at plastic on beaches. We have some work on that. And then this is a picture that I took actually in Iqaluit, Oregon. It's a larger piece of plastic that has been entangled. And so these are all kind of things I think about on a regular basis. Now, in plastic, in the world of plastic, size matters. And so probably lots of you are familiar with kind of what we call macroplastics or megaplastics. These are plastic bottles, and, fishing nets and other things that are really large and we can see. most of my work is in this middle section. So these are mesoplastics or microplastics, and these are plastics you can hold in the palm of your hand and will eat. And there's a couple of different definitions for them depending on what you're talking about, but this is kind of roughly the size. So these squares are 1/2 centimeter by 1/2 centimeter to give you an idea. And, you know, to recognize that they also go really low. So these are kind of ultra fine plastics or even down to nanoplastics. The nanoplastics in particular are plastics that are so small, they can actually cross through your cellular barriers. They can enter a cell. And so this is something that we think about. We don't have a lot of power to detect in wildlife right now, but we do think about as we think about plastics. Now, the history of kind of ingested litter or ingested debris in seabirds actually goes back a lot farther than people think. The first report of a candlestick, so you know, a piece of person-made, man-made litter instead of a bird, goes back to 1838. And it was in this type of bird, the Wilson storm petrel. So this is not a new occurrence for birds. You see this bird is one of the petrels, and they're really cool. They kind of do this pitter-pattering along the surface of the water, and they eat, you know, invertebrates, zooplankton, and things that are at the top. So you can imagine if there's plastic in there or debris of any sort, the birds are going to pick this up. And so this is, you know, the ingestion of non-food items by birds is not a new topic, but certainly the plastic pollution is newer. And these are images of albatross chicks, laden albatross chicks by Chris Jordan in Hawaii. He's done a fabulous job of documenting this. And these are chicks who have starved on the colony, died on the colony before leaving their birth colony. And of course, as the bodies decompose, these stomachs open up, and you can see all the plastics that's been accumulated. It's worth noting that these birds are full. They feel full, but they're actually malnourished at the same time because of the, you know, stomach is physically full, but there's no nutrients coming in. And also, you know, one of the things that I learned about when I was in high school, which, you know, intrigued me to no end, was this accident that was turned into science, where 29,000 rubber duckies actually fell off a cargo ship between Hong Kong and Tacoma, and it was this very particular type of rubber ducky that didn't sink, essentially. And they tracked these rubber duckies for years in the ocean. And Charles Ebbsmeyer actually turned this into a program where he would pay people to recover these and turn them in as part of his program. And these ducks were found all over the Pacific. You know, there's lots of written about them, but they traveled through the Arctic and actually ended up on several beaches in North America and Europe on the Atlantic side. And so I think, you know, I just think it goes to show you that these plastic pieces, these large, intact, highly recognizable plastic pieces are really persistent in the background. So, you know, most of us weren't thinking about plastic pollution and tracking plastic pollution when this rubber ducky incident occurred, but it certainly has told us since a lot about how plastic can move through multiple oceans over decades. And, you know, unfortunately, this still occurs today. Just recently, in 2019, there was actually a large spill that happened. It was the MSC's Zoe, and they lost about 300 containers in a storm. It's in the North Sea, and the shipment containers are actually mostly IKEA furniture and My Little Pony dolls. My 5-year-old daughter thinks is most hilarious. There are now beaches with these My Little Ponies, you know, that wash ashore in high levels. And so it can be, there are many islands in this region, and the debris is highly different between these islands, but you know, there are these islands where this is actually a colleague of mine took this picture where the debris is washing out. So this is still happening in the world today. So we still have plastic inputs from multiple sources. We've looked at this kind of over time, and we actually did a study a few years ago where we went back and we dug in the literature and we looked at all the fish and turtles and mammals and seabirds to see how far back these records go. And at that time, when we did this study, it was up until about 2015, the seabird literature had kind of been tracking this phenomenon the most over time. And so the seabirds are this kind of group it's very useful to think about in terms of, monitoring what can it tell us about plastics and, the fate of plastics in the environment, also the effects. And I would say really interestingly is that the fish are this like kind of little tiny bar or, line on this graph. But since this time and continues, there's a huge amount of work in fish. And so it'll be interesting to see how this unfolds over time. So just a little primer now that we're kind of deep into talking about plastics. There's industrial plastics and user plastics. And industrial plastics are these pellets or nurdles that come out of the hydrocarbons that are used for plastics. It's the raw plastic, and have additives and colors added to them. But this is how plastic is shipped around the world. And then as they go to plastic factories, this is where all of those nurdles and pellets actually get formed into consumer plastic or user plastic. And that's all they do. It's the phones that we're talking on, the computers that you're probably sitting at, the chairs you're on, the desks, all of these things. And it's both types of plastic that enter the ocean each year. So it's about 20 billion pounds of plastic that enter the ocean each year. And unfortunately, it's that plastic that ends up in the stomach of biotas. And so just for context, that means that it's been estimated that about a dump truck of plastics enters the ocean every minute. So just as I started talking, about 10 dump trucks of plastics of, the equivalent of 10 dump trucks have backed into the ocean and kind of, beep, 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 and then dumped in their plastics. And so just something to consider as we kind of move through the talk, this is on, it's not a past event. It has been estimated by a couple of different, kind of international organizations that over 800 species interact with plastic pollution. So that would include entanglement, using it to filter mess. And then just over 200 species have been known to ingest. I will also note that these reports they're not very old, a couple of years, 3 and 4 years old, but there's so much work being done on these topics, and these numbers are being updated all the time, which is actually really why a lot of us are hesitant to kind of put firm numbers on these, because you can make the firm numbers and a week later they're actually changed. Now in the North Sea, over in Europe, so the North Sea is the piece of water between kind of continental Europe, the UK, and Scandinavia. And they've actually been a lot more concerned about plastic pollution longer than most other jurisdictions. And so in the 1970s, there was a few different international conventions. And then specifically in 1992, there was called the Oslo-Paris Convention for the Protection of the Marine Environment. And this was actually one of the first times where they defined plastic pollution in an indicator species. And specifically, this piece of legislation, this agreement actually names a specific seabird. It's called the northern fulmar. Northern fulmars are relatives of albatross, so a lot smaller. And really importantly, the convention actually is very specific around its language. And I don't like to put a lot of words on slides, but I think it's really important to recognize that this is from the legislation or from the agreement. And it says, there should be less than 10% of fulmars that have 0.1 grams or more in their stomach in a sample of 50 to 100 beach fulmars from 5 different regions over a period of 5 years. And what I love about this is that it's actually very specific. It's got the number of sample sizes, it's got the sample regions, it's got a time period, it's got a value. So it's really specific, which is very helpful when we're trying to, when you're scientists, you then have to, carry out these types of programs. And so this is, this has been in place for several decades now, and we're continuing to build upon. And what's really cool is when you have these long-term programs, you can actually start to see changes in time. And so you can see in the 1980s, we actually had higher levels of industrial pellets in the bird. And you can see that we actually see this decline over time. And what's really interesting is that there were a number of programs with industry that kind of recognized these nurdles in the environment and worked with the industry to put into place practices that help reduce the loss of these pellets to the environment. On the flip side of that, we have these user plastics, and then we see these high levels go up. And you can see it kind of goes back down, and the data kind of goes on, but it's really interesting to see these kind of high blips and these lows. So I think this is important. It does show that we have, when we do actions, we can reduce the impact on the environment, but sometimes there's a time lag, but only with these monitoring programs can we actually see if what we're doing is actually leading to the change that we hope for. So we have northern fulmars in Canada. These are species that are present on all 4 of Canada's coast. So this is a picture of North America, Turtle Island. And so you can see that they breed up here in pink, which is the North America, and then year round it's more the purple, and the non-breeding is this blue. So one of the things that we did actually during the last international poll year, and as part of my work on my master's, was to actually look at the plastic ingestion on all 3 of Canada's coastlines. And so we've done this with a variety of partners over time. And so we're going to do a little bit of a quiz, see if you guys are, paying attention, see if we can. In science, it's always good to form hypothesis, do some guessing, some decision making. And so what we're going to do is 4 sites here: Vancouver Island, which is on the Pacific coast of Canada; Prince Leopold Island, which is it's so tiny. It's a very tiny little island way up here in Lancaster Sound. The Labrador Sea, which is this area of water off of the coast of Nunatsiavut, Labrador, and Staten Island again is a very small island off the coast of Nova Scotia. Way down here in Canada. And we actually have Seabird fulmar samples from all 4 of these samples, or all these regions. And what I have, I'm going to switch my camera here. So keep this in mind. There's these 4 sites. And I'm going to turn my camera on. And what we have here, hopefully you can see me. Perfect, thank you, Jessie. What we have here is we have human equivalent. So if you were a fulmar sampled from one of those 4 regions, this is what you would have in your stomach. I'm just going to show you here. So I'm going to show you 4 bags. This is bag 1. It's the fullest, heaviest. And if you were a fulmar sampled at one of these 4 sites, this is what you would have in your stomach. So not what the fulmar has in the stomach. It's very small, but this is what you would actually have in your stomach.
So keep these up, Jennifer. Like, they're not showing right now. Your video is a little iffy, so we're not able to really see the bags right now. So keep them up. But I will toggle back between this. So you're highlighting. Oh, there you go. You're in for a second. So we've got bags full of trash from the various sites that we showed in the first screen. So if you check out the full screen, we've got these 4 amazing, these 4 sites around Canada: Prince Leopold, Labrador, Sable Island, and Vancouver Island. And now we got all 4 bags up. So what we're trying to do for all of you joining in on YouTube and the Arctic Institute channel on Exploring by the Seat of Your Pants, with all the tech difficulties, let's keep it interesting, is try and match which one of the bags of trash is associated with which one of the groups. So basically, in which area did the birds have the most trash inside their stomach, and which area did they have the least? Is that about right, Dr. Provencher?
You got it. So, and we're just going to say bag 1 is the fullest. This would be the human equivalent. 2 and 3 are intermediary, and the smallest bag 4, is the lowest. That's all you have to remember. Bag 1, biggest. Bag 4, smallest. And what I want you to do is think about, of these 4 sites that you can see on the screen, where would you place bag 1, the fullest bag, and 2 and 3 would be the intermediary, and then all the way down to bag 4, which is actually just a tiny little bag with just a few pieces of plastic in it. And
so I'm going
to type it. Yeah.
I'm going to put the call out to people on YouTube. So basically, of the 4 things on the screen right now, of the 4 places across Canada and sort of ending in the US as well, which area would you expect birds to have the most plastic in their stomach versus the least? So I know for me personally, I know that there's a lot of people that live near Vancouver Island. So I would expect Vancouver Island would probably have the most. And I think Prince Leopold Island would probably have the least because it's so far removed from everything else. So that's my guess. And then if anyone else has any guesses tuning in on YouTube, you're welcome to share them there. I'll pass them along if you do. And thank you to everyone on YouTube for highlighting the audio difficulties too. I do appreciate that. We're gonna try and make it work. So far, no one's shared anything. So I'm gonna put my plug in for Vancouver Island as number 1, Prince Leopold Island for number 4 down the list. Maybe Labrador Sea for the second least, and Sable Island for second. I think that the places that are closer to the bigger population centers will have more. And then as you go further north, we'll have less plastic in the bird stomachs. What do you think, Jennifer?
Yeah, Jeff, I think you've got some good rationale there for sure. And I'm going to put up the answers. So I want everyone to think about that there are lots of things that we are exploring. And very few people have actually kind of gotten all the answers right at the very first time. And so I'm going to put up the answers there. Hopefully you can see them. So while Vancouver Island certainly does have a lot of people, I actually find that by mass, it's actually number 2. It's lighter, but interestingly, it has more numerous pieces. So they have lots of little pieces off of Vancouver Island. Where Sable Island actually has the heaviest load of plastics. They're often bigger. And so the bird, if you're a bird, weight matters because you have to fly. And so Sable Island actually has their highest level. You did a Prince Leopold correct. It is the least. So those Arctic birds have the lowest levels of plastic. And so this is interesting because it tells us a little bit more about the source of plastic. And so one thing to keep in mind is that while Sable Island in Atlantic Canada is quite low population, they are downstream. If you think of the Gulf Stream going along this way, downstream from a whole lot of big cities, in the US. And so you often, from a Seabird perspective, have to think about these kind of wider gyres that kind of are operating in these regions. So it's sometimes what we find kind of makes sense, and then other times it kind of challenges us, and we have to think more about where the birds are actually getting their plastics from. So by doing this type of work, we have been able to sample at a whole bunch of different sites. We have Western North Atlantic, so this is Eastern Canada, Eastern North Atlantic, so Europe, and then of course the Western North Pacific, North America. And although there's a little variation in each one of these ocean regions or coastal regions, as we go from north to south, we see an increase. And that happens across these 3 regions. And so it means that really in the Arctic, we've got these low levels, and that occurs, in each one of these regions. And they're much lower in the Arctic as compared to some of the other regions that further south that have been looked at. But of course, seabirds are different. Just because one seabird has plastic pollution doesn't mean they all do. And we see that these are northern flammers we've been talking about. They're surface feeders. And we see high levels in those species, but that Florence Poon, who was a student with me, who has gone on to do a master's at the University of Toronto, she found low levels of plastic in kitty eggs, and these other 2 species, Mers and Guillemot, she found no plastic. So just because one species of seabirds has plastic doesn't mean they all do, which is really important to consider. The other thing is that it can be really high levels of plastic. So this is actually work that Sahar Stave, again, was a student with me. She looked at gulls and all the plastic pollution in the gulls from a dump site in Newfoundland. So these are birds that are often collected or culled because they're a danger to the airport, and so we get to look at them. You can see there's all kinds of not just plastic but litter. You can see aluminum foil. You can even see some packaging. And when you start talking about gulls, you actually can really start to think about all the types of stuff that we throw away and then end up in birds. Now, often people ask me about what are the other types of bird groups, and I don't want to talk about this graph too much, but I do like it. It's colorful and it really, things that all the other things that I've been thinking about it. And then what this is that a colleague, Stephanie Avery Gahn, Okay, well, we've got data on some bird species. What about the other bird species? And so she actually looked at it's called a phylogenetic approach. And so it basically means that our birds that are more related actually have higher levels of plastics that compared to each other than other species. And the answer is yes. And so basically it comes down to, if you're related, you're often more likely to have plastics because there's certain characteristics that those groups of birds have. And so I think, we don't dive into the details of this, but I think it's interesting to think about that there are these different ways to look at it and different ways to examine the relationships. And one of the ways we do this is through standardized methods. And this is, kind of two big pieces of work that my lab did. It basically sets out the map or the protocol for reporting plastics in birds and other vertebrates. And so this is a huge amount of work with a very awesome group of scientists from around the world that we worked on. And so these are papers, they're highly cited, and sometimes this is not the most exciting work to do. You're on a protocol, really, really important if we actually want to compare data, make sure that we're comparing apples to apples and oranges to oranges across the entire globe. And so the other work that we've been doing on kind of the idea of comparing is actually with the Arctic Council. In some of you may know the Arctic Council structure. This is if you're kind of into poli-sci or governance or thinking about how international relations work together, the Arctic Council is a really, really cool model or example. And I'm part of a group that looks at microplastics and litter across the Arctic Council. And so there are these working groups of the Arctic Council where the Arctic states and observers and permanent participants kind of get together and agree to work on topics. And the three that we work with are CAF, PAIN, and AMAP. And for those of you who are familiar with it, they have some really great resources and teaching tools online. But the main idea is that CAF works on the conservation, so whether populations are going up or down. PAIN is really about protection, so making sure there are intact marine environments. And then AMAP does a lot of work on contaminant and climate change. And what those groups are now looking at is more how do we work together on plastic pollution? Because as Jenny said, 10 years ago, there weren't a lot of people talking about this. There's me, and a few others talking about it in kind of conferences and in papers. It wasn't a huge deal, but now it is. And so we actually been doing a lot of work across these groups and coordination among the Arctic Council, and just kind of communicate how some of that stuff is actually working together. It's not always simple, it's not always straightforward, but it's really, really important to do cooperation across international colleagues and boundaries to make sure that, again, want to understand what the levels are in the Arctic, you can actually to compare it. It's also a really cool group to work with. There are 8 of us who are from Canada. We also have members from Kingdom of Denmark, Faroes, Germany, Iceland, Sweden, and the US. And I just put this out there to, again, really show what a cool international group is. And we all bring different areas of expertise to the group with the goal that we have experts in all these different things. And the goal often, right, is, again, although it's difficult and hard sometimes to get, 4 people to agree, it is worth it. It really makes for strong science that can be taken forward. Before we were able to travel bans, we were able to meet in Copenhagen. There's actually 32 experts at this table. And we did discuss kind of all these different environmental compartments. And, I put a picture and I often laugh that this is our group. This is often where science is done. This is often where hard questions of science is answered, is making people sit down either around a physical table or a virtual table and talking about definitions, what the goals are. And I often love this picture because this is actually a time I'm the co-chair of this group, and I made this group sit down, and the to this picture was I basically challenged them to define the smallest size of plastic that they could all measure. They had to come back to me with one number. And so this is, science is in the field, but when we talk about international collaborations, this is often where a lot of those discussions and hard work is done. It's not done in the field, it's done when you have to bring lots of different ideas together. We are working towards a standardized method for the Pan-Arctic region, and you can see a map on the right, and this is a map of all the places that we have plastic and litter data from so far. And we're kind of working to collate and collect all that different information. And basically what we've been asked to do is come up with a number of core recommendations. And so at the bottom, you can see all the different compartments that we discussed, that we talked about. And up at the top, our core recommendations are tier 1 recommendations. We're still working on our wording. Is that everyone should go home and monitor water, marine sediments, beaches and shorelines, and seabirds. And so by doing these, the hope is that when we come back in 5 or 10 years, everyone across the Arctic will have data on these 4 compartments. It will all be done in the same way, and we can make some really cool maps and talk about patterns. We also have been doing work on thinking about not just where plastics end up in the environment, but also how seabirds can be a vector of it. This is really cool work that we have done with Inuit hunters in northern Canada. And typically, what we do is we look for plastics here in the stomach, right? They build in the gut. In this project, we actually looked at just before the poop would come out. When we first published this paper, I was calling it the fecal sample or the guano sample, and review, appropriately. So with the technically it's not guano because it's not out yet. Well, that is a good point. So I often call this the pre-paper. It's like the moment before the actual poop. So we find microplastics in this pre-poop sample. And so we've done some really cool work, colleagues from Kiikatarjuaq, Nunavut, University of Toronto, Acadia, Carmen, where we've actually looked at this bird colony. So this is a colony. It's hard to see, but these are all the birds. That's why it's white. There's no grass, but the birds are there. And then we took air, water, soil, and mussel samples kind of at the bottom of the colony, at the end of the colony, and then every 1 kilometer moving away. And the idea is that if the birds are pooping out all these microplastics, then there's going to be a whole lot of microplastics right under the colony where the poop is, and then as we move away, there'll be less and less. And this is some really work that we've done. So Madeline Bourdieu, she's a student of mine, she quantified all these microfibers. Again, these are poop samples, pre-poop samples, where you look at all these microfibers, and then she used the number of birds on the colony, and she estimated that this bird, these fulmars, at this 1 colony poop at about 3 million pieces per year. But really interesting, the fulmar, which doesn't have as many plastics, they are denser and frankly poop a lot more. They're kind of the brown and pink is kind of all the poop. They potentially are pooping out 45 million pieces a year. So this is some work we're trying to figure out, are bird poop potentially really contaminating the area in the colonies, which are often protected areas. And so Bonnie Hamilton, who's a student at University of Toronto, she's done this work where we looked at atmospheric fallout of plastics. We looked at, again, the bird poop plastics. We looked at the sediments, and we looked at the water. And what she found is a graph here that kind of tells us a little bit, but you can see it really huge here, right? These are fibers, fulmar guano, pre-poop samples are fibers, surface sediments are fibers, and then you've got these paint chips. They're very different. They look like fragments. And so what we've been doing more recently is taking our plastic pieces and we put them into a machine called a Raman or FDIR. And these are actually samples from water in Kiikatarjuaq, in Nunavut. And we can see that almost 50% of these are actually paint-derived plastic samples. And what they look like is actually this. There are these little tiny pieces of plastic paint. And so you can see this for scale. This is a piece of tape, just like a piece of Scotch tape that you all are familiar with. And so these are all these little paint fragments that we pulled out of these water samples. And so we've been talking a lot with our international partners, how to qualify plastic in the traditional sense of the word. They're very much plastic derived. And so that's some of the work that the students have been leading. It's really exciting to start to come out and see what it means for different groups. We do have this other kind of component of our work where we talk about chemicals. So we often think about the physical effects, right? It blocks your stomach. It can cause this false satiation, this false sense of feeling full. But then there's also this chemical effect where you've got plastic additives leaching out. And so this is what I did my postdoc on when I was at Acadia, funded by a few different partners. And, you know, historically, this is again from Madeline's work, but historically we often say fibers or fragments. So this is kind of like the old school way to quantify it. We often have, we're better at doing color. So you can see this is how we would define it as color. And then Madeline's work, as well as many others, have really taken it up a step and started adding polymer type. And so these are the FTIR spectra, so that each piece or gives a spectra, then you match it to a spectral library. And then that allows you to identify it to a spectra. So it's a different way of looking at it. So you can look at the physical shape, you can look at the physical color, and you can look at the polymer type. And this all adds pieces of information to our puzzle. And I think really importantly, the implication for wildlife is that, you know, probably all of you have used plastic to eat on or, you know, serve your food or store your food, but it's all food grade plastic for the most part. So we're not worried about additives leaching out. But when we're talking about birds, they're getting food grade, but also, you know, all kinds of plastic. So they're getting the cocktail of chemical contaminants. It's a lot more challenging. And we've started to look at this in eggs and livers. These are two species. We know that they have low levels of plastic ingestion and high levels of plastic ingestion. And I thought when we started the study that we would have low levels in the kitty wake for these additives and higher levels in the fulmars. But as you can see, you know, there's not really anything different. But I think what's more effective is really tiny little bars down here. And this is what is in the eggs. And so this actually tells us that not only is the bird taking in the plastic additives, but it's actually passing on to their eggs. And so that can be a problem in a pond itself. And so we did this in the birds. And so this, you know, this is from work that we did with Dr. Jalou. And the birds, but we also found the seals. So seals had actually plastic additives in their liver. And so this we go, okay, so seals didn't really look into plastic ingestion before. So this actually led to another study we did with, again, seal stomachs collected by Inuit harvesters. Madeline, again, in mind, she looked at 142 seal stomachs in Nunavut collected in a couple of different places, and we found no plastics. So she looked down to about 425 microns, and she did not find a single piece of plastic. So it's a good news story. It's kind of exciting to find a species with no ingested plastics. It also means that this species is not necessarily for monitoring plastic. So it was, again, another piece of our puzzle. And so just to kind of confirm, you know, go over is that the problem with plastics is that it has both these additives as well as these environmental chemicals. So this is what we're exploring more and more. It's this cocktail of additives. And then lastly, what I'll do is speaks to this idea that we are working a lot with Indigenous partners in science and Indigenous knowledge. And so what the goal of a lot of our work, and it can be done in a couple different ways, is really to understand how these two different knowledge systems can really form each other and produce synthesized and processed information. And because my job is as a government scientist, a lot of what I need to do is inform policy and inform, you know, government actions and agendas. And so in all of my work, we really strive to make sure that we're weaving science and Indigenous knowledge together to inform policy. And I think I'll just end on this idea of braiding Indigenous knowledge and Western science approaches, and we think a lot about this in these days. There's all kinds of different weaves. They can be very tight weaves where the project is very coupled with a community or a nation, or we're co-producing and co-analyzing. some of our plastic projects look like that, but then we also have these loose weave where the communities give research I often refer to as homework, and then we share results, and it's more of like a reporting back and forming discussion. And this is all kind of going on in and amongst our plastic work. So just recognizing that these different ways of knowing are really important to how we're understanding plastics and plastic pollution and its effect on the ecosystem, specifically in the Arctic. And I think I'll leave it there and perhaps take a few questions if there's time.
Fantastic. Well, there's tons of time, Jennifer, so that was great. Feel free to keep your camera off. I know that the connection's a little iffy, and I thank you to all our classes that did stick around for the entire broadcast. You covered so much, so I really appreciate you sharing your time and knowledge with us today. If you want to end your screen share too so that you can see me or however that works, you're welcome to do that. And yeah, we're going to dive in with questions. If you're on YouTube on the AINA channel or on Exploring by the Seat of Your Pants channel, please do share your questions. I'll take as many as I can. But I want to start off with one that we get all the time, which is, how did you get into this career? What was that? Was there something specific that happened to you? Was there a course you took or something as a child that pushed you into this really exciting sort of diverse scientific field?
Yeah, thanks, Jesse. So I actually credit my going into biology to my high school biology teacher. His name was Mr. Ostachek. I grew up in Brampton, Ontario, and I went to Central Peel, and he was a teacher who I didn't have a lot of experience outside of Brampton. It's clearly nowhere near the ocean if you know any geography of Ontario. But he was a diver, and so he would go diving on vacations, and he would bring back pictures of coral reefs and all these cool marine life, and it was super cool. And I just, at that point, I thought, that is something I want to see in this world. And so I went on to do a degree in marine biology, and really just kind of followed a whole bunch of opportunities. People, I was given opportunities to work on different projects and do different things, and yeah, it wasn't ever a planned course, but certainly it was actually my high school biology teacher who set me on this path.
Yeah. Fantastic. It's funny how many great teachers in life can make such a big difference. And you mentioned diving. I want to stress, as we've got a bunch of kids today, if you're ever interested in scuba diving, universally, like Jennifer, everyone who does it seems to really enjoy it. A lot of amazing careers come about from scuba diving. And at 10 years old, you can start on the path to becoming a scuba diver. So if you're keen, no matter where you are, no matter how far from an ocean, there's probably a dive center near you. It's one of the most enriching things you can do. And hopefully when the world opens up again, there's a lot more opportunities. I can't recommend it enough. So Arctic fieldwork, you have the chance to go to these amazing places. What does that look like when you go to the Arctic? For people that might not know, who've never gone, who think of it as some distant wilderness, what is Arctic fieldwork actually like?
Yeah, so it's really interesting. So Arctic fieldwork can look like a lot of different things. So my first time to the Arctic, I was actually working in Alaska. And I was probably about 22 years old. We flew to Juneau. I had a huge shopping list. I had to go by the store, and I loaded everything up on a plane. And the plane actually took us to an island on a seal colony where I had to live with one other person for 2 months. And we didn't see each other a lot because we did shifts. We did observation shifts. So I was technically on the island with one other person, except that I did a 4-hour shift and then they did a 4-hour shift, which basically means you spend 8 hours by yourself every single day. And so, it was winter. So we had short days. So it can look like that. And certainly I've been in a lot of Arctic field camps since then that are similar. We often have, small cabins. You can have outdoor kitchens. It can be a real challenge. The other thing, though, I think that, I want to recognize is that increasingly, because we are doing partnerships with communities and we're trying to actively weave indigenous science and indigenous knowledge, is we spend a lot more time, specifically now for me, I spend a lot more time in community. Yep. And so the field work part of it is whenever I leave my home, and that does mean I might go and sit in community for 2 weeks and meet with people and chat. Sometimes it means doing surveys. Sometimes it means attending meetings and sitting in the back and listening. Right. And so one of the things that I find the most exciting about Arctic fieldwork is that it can mean different things to different people. But as long as you go in, with with ideas about how you can be respectful and collaborative, there's something for everyone.
Yeah. I love this idea of interacting with communities and getting out and connecting with people. So this is something that both Arctic Institute of North America talks about, heavily focuses on. Certainly our last talk that was to sort of both channels at the same time was all about early Arctic research and connecting with indigenous communities and how important that was. At Exploring by the Seat of Your Pants, we have Secret Path Week with 15 plus amazing storytellers every single year in October, not to mention sessions throughout the year. So this is something that, again, a lot of classes are getting really interested in, and Canadians in general are getting really interested in. So it's really nice to hear that this is something that's reflected in modern day research, in plastic pollution research, and beyond. So thank you so much for that answer. We're starting to get some great questions coming in on YouTube that touch upon the same thing. So I'm going to try and take elements of them from each class. So Miss Hartman's class, they're at Eagle Plains Public School. They want to know how plastics have made their way into the oceans, into these waters. Like, how do you end up with plastics in Prince Leopold Island, like up there in the north? How does that happen?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's one that we're struggling with. Certainly that we think that there's 2 or 3 major pathways. One, so you can think about your, a wrapper from your lunch, you put it into the garbage, it gets carried away to a landfill or a dump, and frankly, it can blow out. And so we think that, even if you're good and diligent, it can blow out into the environment. And like the old adage is, all rivers lead to the ocean. So it does end up in the ocean. And again, going back to that rubber ducky example, it moves. Ocean currents can travel large distances, and because plastics are persistent, they go along for the ride. So certainly water is a big one. Yeah. There are other studies where, not so much in the Arctic, but in other parts of the world where shipping can contribute to plastic pollution. So again, right, we don't have shipping in the Arctic per se, but in other places we know containers fall off ships. We know that sometimes it can be intentional. Most of the time it's not intentional, but it can happen. And then the third way, which is one of the things that I'm super interested in, is how animals can move it. So you can imagine that birds like fulmars actually spend the winter out in the North Atlantic, close to that North Atlantic gyre, and then they migrate. And they migrate north and they carry those plastics with them. And so there is some discussion that the birds can actually carry some plastics. It's probably not a big amount, but they can carry some plastics. And so that's a little bit why we did our poop study. And it does kind of speak to the fact that the birds are full of plastics, and they're actually redistributing the plastics around the environment. And we did a study with colleagues in the Faroe Islands where we looked at at nests where the birds, it's like owls, seabirds can kind of eat stuff, and then all the hard stuff they kind of puke back up again into a pellet or a bolus. And we found marine plastics in the bolus. So there's also this idea where birds could be actually eating plastics in the ocean and then redistributing it back onto the land. Yeah. And so you both have these like physical, environmental ways to move plastics. But then the thing that I think we're only beginning to grapple with is how animals actually might also be moving it around.
That is super neat. That's not something that's ever been covered in any of our broadcasts in the past. So I'm really glad you brought that up. But to the point of a lot of plastic getting into the ocean, and that is through rivers. So one of the things that I love to highlight, there's a great organization or a group in Canada, the Great Canadian Shoreline Cleanup. And so a lot of people wonder, oh, okay, well, that's just the coast. You can do that in the east, you can do that in the west. Well, if you're in the middle of Saskatchewan, if you're in the middle of Iowa, the rivers that are there lead to lakes, which lead to the ocean. So it ultimately is all connected. We've found plastic on the bottom of the deepest trench in the world, the most remote Pacific islands up in the northern Arctic, where people haven't put it there, but because of that circulation, you end up with it in the most unlikely places. So it's really worth noting that, not littering is a good strategy all the time, everywhere, but the sort of things that you can do at home or as a government to help curb plastic pollution are applicable no matter where you happen to find yourself in the world. So I'm really glad we got a chance to cover that message. Speaking of government, and before we go to the bevy of classes that are now covering a similar theme, and I love that you guys are all sharing this question, are there things the governments are doing? So your work, you mentioned, super collaborative. You're working with Arctic partners around the globe. You have these great meetings. You're coming up with recommendations. Are governments taking action on plastic pollution in a serious way?
Yeah, I mean, the easy answer is yes and no. I think that I think so. The things I want to stress, though, certainly the Canadian government, who I work for, is committed, and they're perhaps long policy documents that not everyone enjoys reading, but there was they developed a draft science assessment. They've done a Canadian plastic science agenda. We just did a whole bunch of funding for projects to do this. So I would say that one of the things that the Canadian government has done is identify research gaps and then actual funding to address those. But I think more importantly, the kind of at like a bigger, higher scale or level is that one of the things that's really exciting to see Canada lead was the Oceans Charter. That was really, a commitment of trying to get people to think about it. And it was led by Canada, and others have joined, including countries and organizations and industry. I think the UN is a really interesting forum, and the UN Environment Program has been committed to plastic pollution and understanding what that means, how to limit it, and certainly at the Arctic Council. So we're just coming off the Icelandic chairmanship of the Arctic Council. They had plastic priorities listed, and we're moving into a Russian chairmanship for 2 years, and they've identified plastic pollution, is one of the things that they're considering having it as a priority, and that hasn't been finalized yet because they haven't taken over yet, in their cycle of the chairmanship. And so it's something that is on the mind of many people. But I also want to really talk about for a second that it can be really complex. And so plastic pollution is not equally affecting different parts of the globe. And the solutions that we have, even in southern Canada, don't apply to maybe northern Canada or in other parts of the world. And so we often want an easy answer to say, okay, let's get rid of plastic bottles. Plastic bottles suck. Let's get rid of them. That is a great solution for many of us who are in a position where we have running water, we have clean drinking water. But there are many regions in Canada that don't have clean drinking water and need bottled water from a health and safety perspective. And so, and that is true of disaster relief efforts, after hurricanes, and certainly in parts of the world where clean drinking water is a challenge. So while it's easy to address plastic pollution as a problem, kind of identify it, we need, I often refer to it as a toolbox of solutions that all partners can really start to work on and understand. But it really does take, again, hard work sitting down and talking about it.
Couldn't be a better answer if we tried. I love this thing about plastic pollution, that it's become a real international effort and so many groups are working together on it. It is the most apolitical of issues. No one looks at a beach covered in plastic and goes, great. No one sees a bird that is cut open and you have tons of plastic inside it and goes, that's a fantastic thing, right? So it's something that we can all recognize as a species is a serious problem. And it's a really huge area of research, which is why it's so exciting to get to hear from you about all that's going on, because really this is an issue that's been in the public eye for the last 10, if that, years. Certainly in the last 5, Blue Planet 2 is a documentary being released. Canada's chairmanship of the G7 and plastic pollution was listed as a major issue there. So it's getting that sort of public resonance and political action is being taken. Certainly from the other partners we work with in Canada, it's really exciting to see that this is being taken very, very seriously, and there's a lot of work being done to mitigate it. So thank you for sharing all your personal experience of that. So of course, following the government question, the question we're getting from all the classrooms, which I love, I'm going to share it from Ms. Fletcher's class right on the screen. They're exploring human impacts on the environment. What are 1 or 2 key things they can do to help fight the issue of plastics entering our oceans?
Yeah, that's a great question. And one of the things that I talk about the most is we've got to turn the tap off. So if you've got a flood in your basement, the first thing you do is you run to turn the tap off. You don't run to the bucket. You get to the bucket to bail out your basement, but you don't do that first. And so the biggest thing that we can all do is reduce our use of plastic. And again, I think it can be complex. Plastic is very useful. Modern medical miracles happen every day because of plastics. And so I often think about what's our essential plastic, and let's close this loop on that. So anything that's essential, again, medical supplies, we need to figure out how to keep them in the system so we don't lose that plastic to the environment. And then there's a whole bunch of non-essential plastics.
Right.
And so one of the things that I often do when I go to the grocery store, or I have a 5-year-old, she's in grade 1, and I pack her lunch, is what are the things that I can put into reusable containers that is not going to get lost or used in a single time. And we often go to the store and we talk about in the store, what are the things that can we buy? Just say almonds. Can we buy almonds in a package that is 100% recyclable? Or can we, or is there a choice between a package that's not recyclable? So we often look at in an aisle, we look at all the different packaging, let's just say for almonds, and we always try to choose the package that is 100% recyclable. And that can be tricky depending on your area. So I would say that the one thing that you can do is figure out what your non-essential plastic is that you can get rid of. And then the second thing you can frankly do is become an expert at what you can recycle in your area, because that's half the battle. And if you can figure out your recycling system, then you can go into the store and say, I can recycle that, but not that. So let's get the one that has that recyclable plastic on it. And that is a huge thing that everyone can do in their community.
I love the almond story. So for me personally, because of talks like this over the last few years, September, we spend the entire month talking about marine plastics because it's of such interest to classrooms. So for me personally, I used to get milk in plastic bags, our Canadian tradition. And now I get them in a carton. It costs a little bit more, but it is recyclable as opposed to the plastic bags, which aren't. Instead of getting coffee out all the time, which was lovely, and I like getting coffee out, I now brew coffee at home, and that saves a lot of waste and a lot of money. And so those sort of things can often, work together really nicely. Certainly litterless lunches is a great thing that a lot of our kids tuning in can do at home. Don't waste as a general principle is something that we can apply to all aspects of our lives, whether that's plastic, emissions, food waste, all those things help protect species, they help protect ecosystems and more. So I'm really glad we got that question. Thanks, Jennifer. Amazingly, time flies and we're having fun. We are nearing the very end of our broadcast. So what I want to do for kids at home is highlight again, if you want to learn more about Jennifer, jenniferprovencher.com and at Jenny_pro. So you can check her out on social media and her website there. And of course, we want to give a huge thanks again to the Arctic Institute of North America, making this whole series possible, highlighting all these incredible stories from across the Arctic. You can check them out at arctic.ucalgary.ca. We hope you'll join us for more programs soon. Jennifer, before we wrap up today, I know we've covered a lot of great things that kids can do at home. Is there one last message you want to leave us with regards to plastic pollution in the Arctic today?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing that I just want to make sure that, everyone hears and knows is that often I hear kids talk about we've talked about all these things that we know. And I think the biggest communication is there's still so much we don't know. And so for those of you who are interested in participating in beach cleanups and entering that science and going into science, there's so much we don't know. The more, it sounds cheesy, but the more we know about what we don't know. And so, I really encourage you that if this is something that's interesting, follow those science loves. And there's a lot of work to be done. And we need all the different kinds of people and different thinking that we can to tackle these really big problems.
Nice. Well, I can't think of a better message to leave with than that. So what I'll do is say a huge thank you to you and goodbye to all our groups tuning in on ANA's YouTube and on Exploring by the Seat of Your Pants. Jennifer, thank you so much for joining us today, and we hope to have you back soon.